is the second day of our workshop by the Speculative Urban Futures network, and today we have a splendid opportunity to listen to one of the SURF member schools, Elisava, and Dr. Roger Paez is going to give us a kind of overview what kind of theory is behind the pilot brief they are preparing, as we are preparing the pilot number 4 on architectural languages. And the second one would be Adrià Carbonell, architect from Barcelona, and now doing his, or should I say, finalizing his PhD in KTH in Stockholm. And without further ado, please, Roger, the floor is yours. Shall we start?
Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. So today I'm going to try to give, a slight overview of what we've been working in within this project framework, the Speculative Urban Futures project. But as you will see, it's something that goes before and beyond the project. And so I'm going to try to give you an overview on some of the work we've been doing around this idea of situation, room, and game-based design. So I'm not going to go so much in the details of what we are preparing because it's still in the making and it will be more boring, I would say. So hopefully this is a kind of a broader overview of why we think it's interesting to address playfulness and game-based design, game-based processes and design. So I organized this talk in 4 chunks or 4 parts. Each of these 4 parts is based on one article, book, chapter, or project that somehow packages it. And they all address the same basic idea from different perspectives, if you will, or slightly different perspectives. So hopefully the idea is that by the end of the talk, some of the core questions are more or less clear or addressed. The first one that I would like to talk about is this part that I refer to as design with children, and essentially it's just to start saying or to start talking about the fact that when we think about play or games, very often we think in terms of their experts, right? Which are children usually. There's 2 things about that I think which are interesting to mention. On the one hand, I think it's quite obvious that children are particularly brilliant at playing. If only for the reason, as Dr. Seuss said, that adults are only outdated children, right? But essentially because children are using play in their most fundamental, radical way, which is to learn, essentially. The other question that I would like to say here, and it's kind of the main point of the conversation, especially relevant, I think, in an institution such as the Estonian Association of Architects, which is a professional institution, that is that the pity is that we tend to stop playing, or we reduce very much the way in which we play once we become adults, professionals, or more capable socially, if you see what I mean. And so my point here in the beginning was just to address the fact that it is very important, or I think it is very important, to understand that play remains one of the most powerful ways of learning, and one of the most strong ways to understand the world in which we live in different ways that don't necessarily go through the beaten path. So these are just a series of I'm not going to go in detail with all of them, but a series of projects that were done in the past years that talk about that. How can we not only design for children here, but design with children, and quite radically so. That is, understanding that us as designers can sometimes incorporate children and the voices of children directly into the way in which the design process occurs, and not only as consultants, if you will, or as or as end clients, if you will. So this is just a first project that was done by an artist called Douglas Diaz, and it's called Imaginary Weird Things Book. It's essentially a very, very simple format. It's a format of a cadaver ski, if you will. So it's a folded paper, out of which in each of the sectors, essentially first the adult and then the child, or vice versa, start working. Then they start showing what is it that each of them have been doing, and then based on that, they keep reacting to that, and eventually the book becomes, it's a format, right? But the book becomes a very interesting collaborative work. So again, not to go into detail, but just to understand a little bit what is it that we're talking about. Another example, which was also done with children, many in these cases, they're my children because I had them around. But this is a project called Roxubeda, which is it's a map made out of a very long, like a 3-week-long drive through Bordeaux, where we walked systematically all of the city, or at least the central part of the city, identifying neighborhoods based on perception, not based on the administrative delimitations of the neighborhoods. That's why it's interesting working with children. They tend to fixate on certain things and look at certain things and understand certain things, or focus on certain things that perhaps we adults don't tend to. And thanks for that, they generate, or it allows us to generate a different kind of taxonomy of the city, in this case, the city of Bordeaux. Now, based on that, what we did was we cut a conventional map of Bordeaux, following the outlines of these neighborhoods as we defined them during these 3 weeks. And then there was a game-based logic where we combined and recombined based on stories that the children would be telling. As you can see on the left-hand side, these bits and pieces of cities of Bordeaux to generate multiple versions of Bordeaux that were much more closer to the children's understanding, ideas, or even projections and desires on the city, even if they were not, the literal plan of the city. Other examples, this is another derive made in London, in the Barbican Centre, where that was led by back then a 9-year-old child who was obviously very much into Minecraft, as you can see. And then we actually walked during 3 days very extensively through the Barbican Centre in London, absolutely everywhere, doing some kind of a treasure hunt organized by the child. And then it was my task in this case only to report exactly what is it that we were doing, where were we going, how many steps up and down, turning left or right. And then based on these notes, which were simply written notes from me, the child generated this rather incredible Minecraft world, if you will, that quite precisely identifies all the movement and all the spaces that we were discovering in the Barbican. But again, it goes very far away from the conventional, let's say, vision that we would usually have of the Barbican Centre, typically as adults. And the last one that I wanted to show to you is this one called Rubira. This is a square in Gracia, in a neighborhood in Barcelona, close to where we live. And in this case, it was my daughter who I asked her to explain to me what would she do in the square. And of course, she was very much into playing. She drew a lot on the square. They still do it with chalk, if you will. And then she started to proliferate all these existing elements as play elements. And I thought that was very interesting because if you see, I mean, typically when we think about even playgrounds in cities, we tend to associate them, I think, quite badly to elements that are specifically designed, supposedly, for children to play, and that they're only useful for children to play, and they come with a certain kind of aesthetics and ideology. For instance, they're separated from the rest, or they tend to be separated from the rest of the city. They have certain kind of color palette. They have a certain kind of, specificity. But then, so you can see how she identified existing elements. For instance, an existing bench that she then multiplied and then obviously the bench is used for kids to jump around, but not to sit necessarily, or the existing spaces for the trees with a little earth on it, right, which she imagined that could be extended into like a play, a sandbox, if you will, or even the fact that the ground itself could be problematized somehow, and in this case she imagined that there would be some kind of net, and so that the earth could be seen and something could happen. Even interestingly, how the trees or even the existing houses would allow for play elements like to climb or to slide from to be attached. And even more radically, I think, the car or the van, right? How one of these vans that was parked here was assumed to be an element to be taken over through play and not a van anymore. And it could be dismantled and then be used as a play space, if you will. So I thought that's a very interesting point that the child inadvertently, I guess, made, which is that when we think about architecture and play, it's not so much about a certain, let's say, specialized form of space or certain spatial formats that would allow for play, but it's an attitude, essentially, on how do you look at reality and how do you make the most of it. In COVID moments, there were, I published this little article for a Basque festival called Urban that was about, it was called childhood and play as activators of domestic confined spaces, where where I, in this case, essentially reported some of the things that were happening in my house in this case, or the houses that I knew because we were in lockdown. And this is something that happened once in my house when my daughter wanted to go to the beach and couldn't go to the beach, so she literally made a beach. Of course, she did not get to bathe in the sea, which is what she wanted, but it took her like a while to do that, and it was a very interesting exercise on, I mean, to begin with, to think about that you could make a beach, and then how can you make a beach at home, and then the kind of care with which she organized all the beach area. Especially, I like the different kinds of blue, hitting the sand. Of course, then she bathed on the sheets, and the beach was destroyed, but that was part of it. Another interesting one was this is a project, if you will, by the neighbors, the people that live 2 stories above of where my parents live, which has a little, let's say, terrace. And so they had never talked to one another, although they had been living in very close proximity for like all their lives. These children back then were 7 and 9, Valentina and Eulalia. Anyway, so because of COVID and because of the fact that they were in lockdown, they started to throw little clothespins with messages attached to them to what happens to be my parents' apartment terrace. Not because they knew them, but simply because it was there. So in the beginning, there were very generic messages like everything is going to be all right, we're going to survive this. But then eventually, they started getting more and more personal, to the point that my parents started to send the messages back upstairs with little presents or little chocolate or little tea biscuit or something. So eventually that started escalating, and it became like a very beautiful love story that lasted for 4 months very intensively until the lockdown ended, after which they have a much more normal relationship. Now at least they know their names and they say hi, but they don't have this very intense relationship that they had precisely when they were constrained by these conditions, in this case of the lockdown. So how in this case this game element, this very basic protocol of interchange of messages, generated a very strong interpersonal relationship between people, old people and very young people, that they did not know one another, and they would not have known one another otherwise. And the last one that I wanted to share with you in this first part is this one. That's actually a professional architectural commission that I got when we were in lockdown, from a lawyer that wanted to, because of lockdown also, think that after the lockdown he would change the way in which he worked, and he would want to transform his rather large apartment into a home/office, and then leave the office and work in a different way. Of course, what happened is that we were in lockdown. I was at home. I did not have, paper or printers or anything, or model making materials. So I decided I was going to investigate what could we do with my children, which were also home, and we did not know what to do with all the time we had in our hands. So I started talking to my children, and eventually that is the diagram that my oldest son came up with, which, according to my youngest daughter, it was described as mystical wardrobes in a field of nothingness. I guess that has to do because they had seen Narnia a few weeks back, and so this idea of a large closet wardrobe within you enter and something magical and mysterious happens must have been in her mind. Anyway, the idea was a very basic, simple spatial strategy where the whole space would be organized. That would be my translation in a cat drawing. Would be organized in self-contained spaces that were the more, the storage spaces or the bathrooms, the kitchens, etc., that would allow a free-floating space to be organized in a rather fluid way, if you will, around the house. So that the person, depending on the time of the person living there, the lawyer, depending on the time of the day, could use these spaces in different ways. So that the main space of work for the lawyer's office could also be used as a drawing room, etc., etc. So, of course, here what happened is that we did not have any way of testing this in model. And so in this case, it was my daughter who devised this way of making models with books and with Sylvanians and Darth Vader on slippers. That's the title of the project. That allowed us to present this to the client quite literally. The project went on, but sadly it wasn't built. Otherwise, I would love to show you the results. Anyway, this is just to talk about how children are specialists, and we, as researchers, would be clever to look at how children radically use play and games in order to reinvent the world in which we live, to interpret the world in different ways, and then to act accordingly, to transform it in different ways. And I think that this is essentially what we architects and designers, spatial designers anyway, do. No, we read the conditions around us, we try to understand in a certain way what the opportunities are, and then we project, we design, we think ahead for other possibilities that are potentially there, but they have not yet been realized. So the second part, it's a more formal, let's say, account of all of these things that I was trying to introduce now, and this is published in an article in Space and Culture called "A Designer's Playground: Exploring Spatial Design Through Playful Practices." So based on this initial idea that I was trying to address, the question here was to explore how these game-based formats could be incorporated into design processes to inform urban and architectural design, essentially understanding that the role of play in design, the way I see it, and specifically for this use, has three very important points or questions that need to be addressed. No? The first one is constraints, so the idea of facilitating the exploration or an explorative use of either factual or self-imposed constraints that games always have. The second one is the idea of engagement, essentially in the sense of how it can facilitate new types of engagement and authorship through dialogism and other kinds of relations that are not so much based on conventional authorship models in design. And the third one, which to me is super important, and we usually do not think about it in architecture in general, is the question of chance. How can we creatively embrace chance? I mean, chance is possibly the most relevant, I don't want to say the most, but possibly a very relevant condition or agent, if you will, in how cities are, if you see what I mean. And we hardly ever think about that. We always think in terms of plan. And it's very important, I think, to understand that questions like contingencies and pure chance, really, unexpected outcomes, uses that were never intended, are actually essential, thankfully, for the way in which the cities, or to understand the way in which cities are lived and actually work also. So there's a few examples that I'm going to review quickly also here. These are all made with postgrad students of different places and different types. This first one is called Archispiel, and this is a game that we actually did. We designed the whole game. It's essentially like a workshop, a summer workshop, where we designed, Juan Elvira and I designed a game that was a full protocol with everything kind of set up, if you will, and we invited very interesting and very enthusiastic postgraduate students in a beautiful palace in Majorca for a week in the summer to work with it. So the game was essentially to rethink. It was like a radical urbanism game, if you will. It was to rethink urbanistically a rather complex place called Magaluf. It's one of the epitomes of mass tourism in the Balearic Islands, and we needed to. And we were asked by the government of the islands to think about it as architects. And we thought that rather than, seeing that the place was already so extreme and so absurd and so uncontrolled and so everything that you can imagine, we thought that a very conventional or more conventional approach to understanding the possibilities that existed there in terms of conventional urban design was mood there, because the place is really, well, I don't know whether you've been there, but it's quite extreme. And so we thought, why don't we use a very radical approach, and why don't we try to use games to, in this case a role-playing game, to exacerbate certain conditions that exist there, many of which we think are extremely negative, related to mass tourism essentially. But rather than playing, the good son and trying to say, okay, how could we revert some of these tendencies? Why don't we use a role game based logic so we can exacerbate these tendencies and see where would that lead us? Because that on the one hand would allow us to very critically think and allow our clients, in this case the government of the Balearic Islands, to understand where could this be leading to, and so that has a very strong, let's say, political impact. But also because if you really push certain ideas that are seeds that exist in these rather strange realities that we typically don't try to look at, sometimes you get very interesting, let's say, results. So this was a game that was placed, as you can see, in a huge game board. This is just a part of it. It was bigger than this room. We would be walking on a schematic model of the city, like the bad guys in James Bond. Something I always wanted to do, to walk on the city, as you say, move this thing from here to there. And the whole question was a role-playing game where we identified certain agents that had a very strong impact in how the city was developed. And they started to establish, during 3 days in this case, very intense relationships and negotiations and playing, as you can see, if you will, a developer's game. The result was it was played twice, and of course, because there was chant introduced, there were elements that were changing quite a lot, and then these were the results. The results were two huge, very, very large, we call them tableaux de bataille, because they were these very, very large, like 7 meter by 2.5, 3 meter tall single images that had absolutely everything in a totally excessive way, but had absolutely everything that had been thought of and prototyped in them. They were very large, as you can see here. So they were also placed on the ground. So you could literally be inside this rather environmental sort of documents, right? It was a very, very excessive document, but we were very interested in showing simultaneously this very large scale of the operation, and also the immense amount of details and the weaved narratives that went through these different scenarios. Right? Another example is this one, which is called community plugins. In this case, it's a collaboration between Elisava School of Design and Engineering in Barcelona and the School of Architecture in Mumbai, India. And here we did a collaboration where we were working simultaneously at a distance and then together. And when we were working at a distance, the Barcelona team identified certain spatial conditions of the place in which we were working, which was a specific part of the old town of Barcelona. While the Indian team, what they did was to identify, let's say, inhabitation practices that happened in certain places in Mumbai, with the idea that when we would all join together in Barcelona, in a way, we would, the Catalan team would be learning from the Indian team in terms of, let's say, the program or the ways in which these spaces are used in India, whereas the Indian team would learn from the Catalan team of the spatial possibilities or conditions that we could work with, and then together we would make a proposal. So that's what happened. This is the actions from the Indian team. This is some of the spatial conditions from the Barcelona team, and these were some of the research on certain options that were there for us to explore. That's the way in which we work. The workshop dynamics were these. So we started with this survey in Barcelona and in Mumbai. So spatial survey and, let's say, if you will, performative survey. Then we incorporated chance in order to give game, if you will. Then, based on the cards that you had, we began to strategize. Then there were moments of negotiation, which is very typical of game logics also. And then we iterated this, which is also very important in games, doing the same thing over and over and over again in different rounds, so that decisions can be fine-tuned also. And then finally, we made a design, which in this case also was a design that was directly modeled on a very large model, so that there were no kind of mediation systems in between. That was important also because we had relatively little time to do it, and then we didn't want the different, even technical skills of the two contingents of students to interfere there. So we went on a very, very basic, low-tech, large model like that to literally implement the ideas. It was also fun because we ended up destroying the model as part of a celebration.